The night had settled gently over the distant Roman outpost, wrapping the hills in a cool silver light that softened the edges of stone walls and olive trees. On the outer watch platform stood Marcus Valerius, a soldier who had worn the red cloak of Rome for more years than he could easily remember. His armor no longer shone the way it once had, and the leather straps creaked softly when he shifted his weight, but Marcus did not mind these small signs of time. In fact, tonight he welcomed them. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant sea salt, and the stars above seemed unusually patient, as if they too were keeping watch. Marcus rested his hands on the wooden railing and looked out across the quiet valley where moonlight painted pale shapes across the land. Years ago he might have searched the darkness for movement, an enemy torch, a rider on the road, the glint of metal, but tonight his gaze was softer, wandering slowly across the peaceful hills. Somewhere far below, a small stream moved over stones with a gentle whisper, a sound so steady it almost felt like breathing. The fort behind him slept. A few torches burned low in iron brackets along the wall, their flames flickering lazily whenever the wind drifted by. Marcus could hear the occasional murmur of a sleeping soldier turning in his blankets, and once the distant rustle of a horse shifting in the stable. These sounds had become familiar companions through many long nights. Yet tonight felt different. Earlier that evening the centurion had spoken quietly to him beside the gate, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder with a calm respect that needed no explanation. After this watch, Marcus would no longer stand guard. His service was ending with the sunrise. The thought did not bring sadness. Instead it settled in his chest like a warm, steady glow. For 20 years he had followed the rhythm of marching, training, guarding, and waiting. Now, for the first time in a very long while, there would be mornings without armor and evenings without the sound of the watch horn. Marcus breathed in slowly, filling his lungs with the cool night air, and exhaled just as slowly, letting the quiet valley hold the moment. Somewhere an owl called softly from the dark hillside. Marcus smiled faintly, adjusting his cloak against the gentle breeze, and returned his eyes to the horizon, ready to spend this last watch the same way he had spent so many before, patient, calm, and listening to the quiet world beneath the stars. Marcus shifted slightly on the wooden platform, letting his shoulders relax as the quiet night stretched onward. The rhythm of standing watch had long ago become second nature to him, like breathing or walking a familiar road. His eyes moved slowly across the horizon, but his thoughts began to drift inward, wandering along the long road of years that had brought him to this quiet outpost. When Marcus had first joined the Legion, he had been barely more than a boy from a small farming village in the hills of Latium. The world had seemed enormous then, filled with distant cities, wide rivers, and lands whose names sounded like stories from travelers' mouths. He remembered the day he left home, the dusty road, the warm sun on the fields, and his mother standing beside the wooden gate, waving with a calm smile that tried to hide her worry. His father had simply nodded once, the way men sometimes do when words feel too heavy to carry. Marcus had walked down the road with a new cloak, a small pack, and the strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty that follows anyone stepping into the unknown. The early years in the Legion had been loud and restless, marching boots, clanging shields, shouted orders, and long roads that wound through forests, mountains, and unfamiliar towns. But even in those busy days there had been moments of quiet like this one. Nights beside campfires, the soft murmur of soldiers sharing stories. The steady crackle of wood burning beneath a sky full of stars. Marcus had learned then that the life of a soldier was not only about battle or training, but about patience. Much of it was waiting, waiting for dawn, waiting for orders, waiting for the slow turning of seasons. He ran a hand along the smooth wood of the railing, remembering other watch posts, other forts built from stone or timber along distant frontiers. Some had stood beside roaring rivers, others in windy plains where the grass moved like waves under the sky. Each place had carried its own sounds and scents, yet the feeling of night watch had always been the same, a calm space between the busy hours of day and the dreams of sleeping men. Behind him, the fort remained quiet. A torch crackled softly, sending a few sparks drifting upward before fading into the darkness. Marcus glanced back for a moment at the sleeping courtyard. Young soldiers rested there now, men not so different from the boy he had once been. They still had many watches ahead of them, many roads to walk. Marcus felt no envy, only a gentle understanding of how time moves forward, step by steady step. He returned his gaze to the moonlit hills beyond the wall. The night air felt cool and peaceful against his face, and he breathed deeply again, letting the quiet settle around him like a familiar cloak. This last watch was passing slowly, just as it should. Carrying with it the calm memories of a life spent beneath many different skies. The moon had climbed a little higher by the time Marcus heard the soft creak of the ladder behind him. He did not turn immediately. After so many years he could recognize the careful steps of a soldier trying not to make noise. A moment later a young voice spoke quietly. "Marcus. Are you awake?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile before glancing over his shoulder. Standing near the edge of the platform was Lucian, one of the youngest recruits in the fort. His helmet sat slightly crooked, and his cloak looked far too large for his narrow shoulders. Marcus had noticed him often during drills, earnest, attentive, always trying to do things exactly right. "I should hope I'm awake," Marcus said softly. It would be a poor watchman who slept through his final duty. Lucian stepped closer, resting his hands on the railing and looking out across the quiet valley just as Marcus had been doing all night. For a moment neither of them spoke. The hills lay silent beneath the moon, and a light breeze moved gently across the grasslands below the fort. "They told me this was your last watch," Lucian said after a while. Marcus nodded once. 20 years is long enough for any man to stand at the wall. The young recruit seemed to think about that. "Does it feel strange?" he asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. Strange was not quite the right word. What he felt was more like standing at the end of a long road and seeing a peaceful valley waiting beyond it. "No," Marcus said calmly. "Not strange. Just quiet." Lucian leaned forward slightly, studying the horizon as if trying to imagine what Marcus saw. "I hope I'm as calm as you when my time comes." Marcus chuckled softly under his breath. "If you serve long enough, calm tends to find you." The young soldier watched the stars for a moment before speaking again. "Do you ever get tired of the night watches?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Not really. Nights like this remind you that the world is larger than the fort walls. Larger than Rome itself, perhaps." Lucian followed his gaze upward to the stars scattered across the sky like distant lanterns. The silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward, the kind that comes when two people simply share the same view. Somewhere far away a night bird called, and the faint sound of the stream reached them again from the valley floor. Marcus rested his arms on the railing and breathed in the cool air once more. The young recruit beside him seemed eager, full of questions about the years ahead, but for now both soldiers simply stood together on the quiet wall, watching the patient sky and listening to the calm rhythm of the night. For a while Marcus and Lucian stood in companionable silence, their eyes drifting across the gentle shapes of the moonlit hills. The quiet of the night seemed to invite calm thoughts rather than hurried words. Eventually Lucian shifted slightly and glanced toward Marcus again. "You must have seen many places," he said, his voice low so it would not carry across the sleeping fort. Marcus gave a small nod, remembering roads that stretched far beyond the horizon. "More than I ever expected when I first left my village," he replied. Lucian leaned against the railing, curiosity bright in his expression. "Which place was the most beautiful?" Marcus did not answer immediately. The question carried him through years of memory, dusty plains, mountain passes, and rivers wide enough to reflect entire skies. "There was a valley in the north," he said at last, speaking slowly as if the image were forming again in front of him. "Tall green hills, a wide river that curved like a silver ribbon, and forests so quiet you could hear the wind moving through every branch. We built a small fort there during one summer. At night the fireflies would float above the grass like tiny stars." Lucian smiled faintly, clearly imagining it. "It sounds peaceful." Marcus nodded again. It was. The locals used to bring baskets of fruit to trade with the soldiers. Apples sweeter than any I had tasted before. Lucian laughed softly. "The quartermaster here would never allow that much sweetness near the barracks." Marcus chuckled at that, the sound warm and relaxed. "No, I suppose he would not." The breeze shifted gently, stirring the edges of their cloaks and carrying the distant rustle of olive leaves along the hillside. Lucian rested his chin on his hand, still looking out over the valley below. "Did you ever feel afraid during all those years?" he asked quietly. Marcus considered the question without hurry. Fear had visited every soldier at some time or another, but it rarely stayed long. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But fear passes like a storm. What remains afterward is the road you continue walking." Lucian seemed to absorb that thought slowly, nodding once as if storing it away for the future. Above them the stars shone steadily, untouched by the passing concerns of men. Marcus looked upward for a moment, noticing how the constellations had shifted slightly since the beginning of his watch. Time moved quietly in the sky just as it did in the lives of soldiers below. He felt a calm satisfaction knowing that this peaceful conversation, beneath these patient stars, had become part of his final night on the wall. And though the watch was not yet over, Marcus could already sense that the night was guiding them gently toward the first faint hints of morning waiting somewhere beyond the hills. The night moved onward with the quiet patience of a river, and the hours of Marcus's final watch continued to pass gently beneath the wide sky. The moon had drifted a little farther west now, casting longer shadows across the courtyard stones of the sleeping fort. Lucian remained beside him at the railing, his earlier questions giving way to a calm stillness that Marcus recognized well. It was the feeling that often settled over soldiers during the deeper hours of the night, when conversation fades and the mind simply listens to the quiet world. Far below the wall, the small stream continued its soft whisper among the rocks, steady and unhurried. Marcus had heard that same kind of sound beside many different camps over the years. And it had always reminded him that nature kept its own gentle rhythm no matter where the legions traveled. He rested his hands comfortably on the railing, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers, worn by countless watchmen before him. Somewhere in the stable a horse snorted softly, then settled again into sleep. A torch near the stairway flickered with a faint crackle, its glow warm against the cool darkness of the wall. Lucian lifted his gaze toward the stars once more. "They look brighter out here than they do in the towns," he said quietly. Marcus followed his eyes upward. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like grains of silver dust across the deep blue night. "Cities have many lights," Marcus replied calmly. "But the stars are patient. They wait for quiet places." Lucian nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense. For a while he traced shapes among the constellations, pointing once toward a cluster he thought looked like a chariot. Marcus smiled faintly at the effort, remembering how soldiers throughout history had done the same thing, finding stories in the sky to pass the long hours of watch. The breeze shifted again, carrying cooler air down from the hills. Marcus pulled his cloak slightly closer around his shoulders, though the chill was gentle rather than harsh. He felt awake, but also deeply calm, as though the night itself were inviting him to slow down and notice every small detail, the quiet creak of the wooden platform, the distant rustle of grass in the valley, the slow movement of clouds passing far above the stars. These were the kinds of moments a soldier rarely remembered during busy days, yet they were often the ones that stayed with him the longest. Lucian leaned forward again on the railing, watching the pale mist beginning to gather faintly near the stream below. "Morning will come soon, won't it?" he asked softly. Marcus studied the horizon for a moment. The darkness there had begun to soften just slightly, though the change was so subtle that only an experienced watchman would notice it. "Yes," Marcus said gently. "The night is turning." And with that quiet realization, the two soldiers continued their silent watch, waiting patiently as the world prepared for the first slow hints of dawn. The change in the night was so gradual that it might have been missed by someone unfamiliar with long watches, but Marcus noticed it easily. The darkness along the eastern hills had softened from deep black to a faint shade of blue, as though the sky itself were slowly breathing in preparation for morning. He rested his elbows on the railing and watched the horizon carefully, the same way he had done on countless mornings throughout his years of service. Lucian followed his gaze, squinting slightly as if trying to see the difference Marcus had already recognized. "I think I see it," the young recruit said after a moment. "The sky is changing." Marcus nodded. "Dawn always arrives quietly. It never rushes." The cool air carried a slightly different feeling now, fresher somehow, as though the land itself were beginning to wake. Below the wall, the mist around the small stream had grown thicker, drifting slowly across the valley floor like a pale blanket. The olive trees on the hillside stood in still silhouettes, their leaves barely stirring in the gentle breeze. Somewhere far away a rooster crowed faintly from a distant farmstead beyond the hills, its call echoing softly across the quiet land. Lucian smiled at the sound. Someone out there is starting their day already. Marcus imagined a farmer stepping out into the cool morning air, perhaps stretching beside a small stone house before beginning his work. The thought felt comforting in its simplicity. Life beyond the walls of forts and cities often followed calmer rhythms than the marching schedules of soldiers. Behind them the fort was beginning to stir in small, sleepy ways. A door creaked somewhere in the barracks. A pair of soldiers murmured briefly before falling quiet again. The torch near the stairs had burned down to a small orange glow, its flame now little more than a steady ember. Marcus watched the eastern horizon grow a shade lighter with each passing minute. Soon the first thin line of gold would appear between the hills and the sky. Lucian seemed thoughtful now, perhaps realizing that Marcus's final watch was nearing its end. "What will you do when the sun rises?" he asked gently. Marcus considered the question with a calm expression. For so many years his days had been shaped by orders, schedules, and duties that the idea of open time felt almost unfamiliar. Yet it did not trouble him. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "I will walk for a while. There is a road that leads through those hills." He pointed faintly toward the east. "I have watched it from this wall for many years. It might be time to see where it goes." Lucian nodded, clearly liking the idea. The two soldiers returned their attention to the horizon once more as the sky continued its slow transformation. The stars were beginning to fade. One by one, like lanterns being gently extinguished. And as the first pale light of morning quietly approached, Marcus felt the steady certainty that his long night of service was finally drawing to its peaceful close. The eastern sky continued its slow transformation, the pale blue growing softer and brighter as the final stars faded quietly into the light of approaching morning. Marcus watched the horizon with the steady attention of a man who had greeted many dawns from many different walls. Each sunrise was similar, yet never exactly the same. This one felt especially calm, as though the world itself understood that something gentle was coming to an end. The hills that had been dark silhouettes during the night were now beginning to show their shapes more clearly. Olive groves appeared like soft patterns across the slopes, and the winding path through the valley slowly revealed itself as a thin, pale ribbon stretching toward the distant farms. Lucian rested both arms on the railing, his earlier energy replaced by a thoughtful quiet. "It feels different in the morning," he said softly. Marcus nodded. "Night is a time for listening. Morning is a time for beginning." The young recruit seemed to consider that, watching as the sky slowly shifted from blue to the faintest touch of gold along the edge of the hills. The breeze that moved across the fort now carried the cool freshness of early morning, brushing gently against their cloaks. From the courtyard below came the quiet signs of soldiers waking. Someone yawned loudly near the barracks door. A bucket clinked softly beside the well. A stable hand began speaking quietly to one of the horses, his voice calm and familiar. These sounds were the gentle start of another ordinary day in the fort, yet for Marcus they marked the closing moments of a long chapter in his life. He looked once more across the valley he had guarded through so many nights. The stream that had whispered in the darkness now reflected faint streaks of early light. Birds had begun to stir in the olive trees, their first soft calls echoing across the hillsides. Everything seemed to move at the same unhurried pace, as if the world preferred a slow awakening rather than a sudden one. Lucian glanced at Marcus with quiet respect. "I'm glad I shared this watch with you," he said. Marcus gave a small, warm smile. "So am I." For a moment neither of them spoke again. They simply stood side by side, watching the first thin edge of sunlight begin to glow behind the hills. The light spread slowly, touching the highest branches of the olive trees first, then sliding down the slopes toward the valley floor. Shadows retreated gently, and the sky brightened with warm colors that seemed to stretch endlessly above the land. Marcus breathed in deeply, filling his lungs with the cool morning air. After 20 years of watches, roads, and distant horizons, the sun was rising on a different kind of day. And as the light grew stronger, Marcus felt the quiet certainty that this dawn was not only the end of a night, but the beginning of a peaceful road waiting just beyond the walls. The sunlight had not yet reached the walls of the fort, but the sky now glowed with soft shades of gold and pale rose above the eastern hills. Marcus remained at the railing, quietly observing the slow arrival of morning. The valley below, once hidden in darkness, had awakened into gentle detail. The narrow road that curved through the hills was clearly visible now, winding between olive trees and low stone walls built long ago by farmers who knew the land well. Thin threads of smoke began rising from distant farmhouses where early fires were being lit for the day's first meal. Lucian followed Marcus's gaze toward the road. "That must be the one you mentioned," he said. Marcus nodded. "Yes. I have watched travelers move along it for many years. Merchants, farmers, messengers. Sometimes even wandering musicians." He paused, remembering quiet figures passing through the valley at sunset or dawn, their journeys carrying them far beyond the walls of the fort. "Every road leads somewhere," he added gently. Behind them the fort had fully begun to wake. The wooden gate creaked as it was opened slightly to allow fresh air into the courtyard. Soldiers stepped out of the barracks stretching their arms and shoulders, their voices still low with sleep. The smell of bread warming over a small fire drifted faintly upward from the kitchen area, mixing with the cool scent of morning grass carried by the breeze. Marcus glanced once more across the horizon. The sun itself was still hidden behind the hills, but its light now spread steadily across the sky. Soon the first bright edge would appear above the ridge, and with it the end of his final watch. For 20 years the rising sun had signaled the same routine, the changing of the guard, the return to the barracks, another day shaped by orders and duty. Today would be different. Lucian seemed to sense the significance of the moment. "Will you miss it?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the wall, the valley, and the silent watchtower where Marcus had spent so many nights. Marcus considered the question carefully. He rested one hand on the smooth railing, feeling the familiar wood beneath his fingers. "I will remember it," he said. "But remembering is not the same as missing. Some things are meant to stay behind us so we can walk forward." The young recruit nodded slowly, absorbing the words with thoughtful respect. Around them the morning continued to grow brighter. The birds in the olive trees now sang freely, their voices filling the valley with lively sound. The mist near the stream began to lift and drift away under the warming light. Then, at last, the first bright edge of the sun appeared above the eastern hills. A warm beam of light reached across the valley and climbed slowly toward the walls of the fort. Marcus watched it calmly as it approached the watchtower. In just a few more moments, the sunlight would touch the very place where he stood, and with it, his long night of duty would quietly come to its end. The first ray of sunlight finally reached the stone wall, touching the edge of the watchtower with a warm, quiet glow. Marcus watched as the light slowly spread across the platform, illuminating the wooden railing, the worn boards beneath his boots, and the red folds of his cloak. It felt gentle rather than dramatic, as though the morning had arrived not to announce itself loudly, but simply to place a calm hand on the world. The valley below brightened at the same slow pace. Olive trees that had stood in soft shadows now shimmered with silver-green leaves, and the narrow road through the hills glowed faintly in the early light. Lucian straightened slightly as the sunlight reached them. "There it is," he said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yes. The watch is over." The words carried no heaviness. Instead, they felt steady and natural, like the closing of a well-read book. For a moment Marcus remained where he was, letting the warmth of the morning sun rest against his face. After so many years of greeting the dawn as a soldier, he allowed himself to fully notice it this time, the warmth, the brightness, the quiet promise of a new day. Behind them, footsteps sounded on the ladder as the next watchman climbed toward the platform. A sturdy soldier named Quintus appeared at the top, adjusting his helmet as he stepped onto the boards. "Morning, Marcus," he said with a relaxed smile. "Looks like the sun kept good time today." Marcus returned the smile. "It always does." Quintus glanced around the horizon in the practiced way of someone beginning his duty, making sure all was calm beyond the walls. The valley lay peaceful under the rising sun, just as it had through the long night. Lucian stepped aside to give the new watchman space, though he remained close by. Marcus placed his hand once more on the railing, running his fingers briefly across the smooth wood that had supported so many long hours of quiet vigilance. He felt no need for grand words or formal farewells. The moment itself carried enough meaning. "Well," Quintus said with a friendly nod. "I'll take it from here." Marcus inclined his head calmly. "The wall is yours." He turned toward the ladder and descended slowly, each step steady and unhurried. When his boots touched the courtyard stones, the sounds of morning surrounded him, soldiers speaking quietly, the clatter of wooden buckets near the well, the gentle snort of horses in the stable. Everything felt familiar, yet lighter somehow. Lucian climbed down a moment later and stood beside him. The young recruit looked toward the eastern gate, where the road beyond the hills waited in the brightening light. Marcus followed his gaze and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Valerius was no longer the man standing watch on the wall. The fort behind him would continue its routine, just as it always had. But ahead of him lay open roads, quiet fields, and days that belonged entirely to the peaceful rhythm of the world beyond the walls. The morning had fully arrived by the time Marcus walked across the courtyard toward the eastern gate. The sunlight now rested warmly on the stone walls of the fort, turning their pale surfaces golden. Soldiers moved calmly through their morning routines, some drawing water from the well, others speaking quietly near the barracks as they prepared for the day's duties. The familiar sounds no longer felt like part of Marcus's responsibilities, yet they still carried a sense of comfort. For many years this place had been his world. Lucian walked beside him for a short distance, matching Marcus's steady pace. The young recruit seemed unsure what to say now that the watch had truly ended. Eventually he spoke softly. "You'll probably see many roads now." Marcus smiled faintly. "Yes. But I think I'll walk them slowly." Lucian nodded, understanding that the years ahead would move at a gentler rhythm than the life Marcus had known inside the fort. They reached the gate together. 2 guards stood there finishing their morning shift, leaning casually against their spears as the sunlight stretched across the ground outside. Beyond the gate the narrow road curved through the hills just as Marcus had watched it do from the wall for so many nights. In the daylight it looked peaceful and inviting, winding between olive trees whose leaves shimmered softly in the breeze. Marcus paused for a moment at the threshold. He turned slightly and looked back at the fort one last time. The watchtower stood quietly against the bright sky, its wooden platform now occupied by another soldier beginning a new day of duty. Marcus felt no sadness as he looked at it, only a quiet appreciation for the many nights he had spent there beneath the patient stars. Lucian stopped beside him. "I think the road will be glad to meet you," he said with a small grin. Marcus chuckled softly. "I hope so." A farmer's cart appeared in the distance along the road, its wheels rolling slowly over the pale dirt as it approached from the valley. Birds drifted through the morning air, their wings catching the sunlight as they crossed the sky. The world beyond the fort felt wide and calm, filled with the simple movement of ordinary life. Marcus adjusted his cloak, though he no longer wore armor beneath it. The light felt warm on his shoulders as he stepped forward through the open gate. His boots touched the dusty road for the first time, not as a soldier marching under orders, but as a traveler walking freely toward whatever lay beyond the hills. Lucian remained at the gate watching him go, raising a hand in farewell. Marcus returned the gesture without turning fully around, continuing down the road at an easy, unhurried pace. The fort behind him slowly grew smaller as the path carried him into the quiet countryside. Olive trees rustled softly in the breeze, and the morning sun climbed steadily into the sky. Marcus Valerius walked on, breathing deeply, feeling the calm rhythm of each step beneath his feet. And as the road curved gently between the hills, the former soldier disappeared into the peaceful light of a new day, his long watch finally complete, and the quiet journey ahead just beginning.